everyone, and welcome to our June HealthLinks webinar on cultivating belonging. We're going to be excited about having a conversation today about inclusion and equity, belonging in the workplace. We're just allowing everyone a moment to join the Zoom virtual space. Thank you for being here today for this third installment of the HealthLinks webinar series of 2025. Great. Thanks again, everybody, for being here today. HealthLinks is honored to continue this conversation about belonging in the workplace. For those of you that are familiar with our program, please use the chat function to tell us where you're joining us from. It's great to see the representation from so many states around the US and countries internationally as well. All of our participants today, not our speakers, but our participants are on mute for the duration of today's webinar. We ask you to use the chat not only to tell us where you're from, which we see so many of you doing right now. Thank you so much for doing that, but also for any technical assistance you may need using the webinar platform here. Questions, however, we ask you to move to the Q&A section of the Zoom toolbar, right? There are individuals on this webinar that may have the same questions as you, and when we get to that portion of the webinar, you can use the thumbs up feature to vote on questions and move them up for us to ask for the speakers today. Closed captions are available for those of you that need closed caption services. Please use your Zoom function, Zoom toolbar to access closed captioning. And we know so many of you are here to achieve and sustain your continuing education credits. There will be a survey that pops up at the end of today's webinar. Make sure you stick around for that survey. Within a couple minutes towards the end of the hour, we'll also put the link to the survey in the chat for those of you that are not able to access it. And also today's webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording upon conclusion in the next 48 hours or so from participating in today's webinar. A little bit about me and a little bit about us. My name is David Shapiro. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a white male in my late 40s. I have dark brown curly hair and a brown beard. I work at the Centers for Health, Work, and Environment, and I direct and oversee the HealthLinks program, which is a public health outreach program. We use the total worker health approach to engage employers on worker health and safety. And we have a pretty standard process of assessing organizations, doing customized or tailored advising, and then working on action planning for the organization as well. We have a validated survey called the Healthy Workplace Assessment, and within that assessment, there are some questions on belonging and engagement, on equity and engagement in the workplace as well. As I mentioned, we're located at the Centers for Health, Work, and Environment. We are one of 10 centers of excellence for total worker health, and we're located at the Colorado School of Public Health on the Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora, Colorado. We always start with a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to read that now. As we gather in this virtual space, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. And with this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples to the fields of medicine, mathematics, government and military service, arts, literature, engineering, and more. We also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. We recognize and affirm these ties, the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands, and the many indigenous people who thrive in this place alive and strong. We also acknowledge the painful history of ill treatment and forced removal that has had a profoundly negative impact on Native nations. We respect the many diverse indigenous people still connected to this land. We honor them and thank the indigenous ancestors of this place. The University of Colorado pledges to provide educational opportunities for Native students, faculty, and staff, and advance our mission to understand the history and contemporary lives of Native peoples. I want to mention that today's webinar will have some conversations about race, racism, equity. The views and opinions that are expressed today are those solely of our presenters and not of the HealthLinks program, the Centers for Health, Work, and Environment, or the Colorado School of Public Health. We encourage you to engage with this webinar and platform in any level that you feel comfortable with. That being said, this is a professional webinar and event, and we expect adult perspectives and attitudes during today's webinar as well. Remember, too, that a recording of the webinar will be available to you after today's presentation. And so if you need the recording and you need to hop off at any point, we understand that as well. So thanks everyone for understanding that today's topics can be sensitive and to engage with the content in a professional manner in a way that you see fit. If anyone is ever dealing with a crisis personally or with a colleague, 988 is the crisis hotline to call or dial for any support or help. Today's agenda is we'll have a keynote presentation followed by a brief panel discussion and question and answer. And our goal today is to help you identify emerging challenges and opportunities for enhancing your employee engagement program and support in the workplace for populations that have been historically marginalized. We want to also explore practical strategies for developing policies and practices that address systemic barriers, specifically in the workplace. And finally, learning how to cultivate a culture of belonging and empowerment through sustainable initiatives. I should mention that this June marks our 6th year in a row where we've had a conversation about culture and belonging in the workplace. Since June of 2020, we've hosted this webinar, and we're really honored and grateful that we get to continue these conversations with all of you. All of those recordings on previous years' presentations are available as well. And with that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Dwanita Mosby-Tyler. Dr. Dwanita is the chief catalyst and founder of the Equity Project, a consulting firm supporting organizations and communities in building diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. She is the former Senior Vice President of Human Resources and Chief Inclusion Officer for Children's Hospital Colorado, the first African-American woman to hold that position in the organization's over 100-year history. She's also the former Executive Director of the Office of Human Resources for the City and County of Denver, the first African-American woman to hold that position in the agency's 63-year history. Dr. Mosby-Tyler is nationally recognized for her work on equity. She has received many local and national awards for her service and leadership accomplishments. She holds a doctorate in the field of organizational leadership from the University of Colorado, a Master of Arts degree in management from Webster University, and a Bachelor of Science degree in education from the University of Alabama. She is currently pursuing a second doctorate degree in EDD from the University of Southern California. So thank you so much, Dr. Mosby-Tyler, for being here with us today. I'm going to turn over the presentation to you.
David, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. I was watching the chat, and of course, I'll give a shout out to people from Colorado because that's where I live. But I also saw my peeps from Atlanta because that's where I grew up. I welcome all of you, but got to say hi to Atlanta and Colorado. It sure is a pleasure to be with you and in what is really a complicated time. So I'm going to jump right in. I'll share my screen. One of the things I'll say to you also, I think it's always a good idea to describe who you are and what you look like for people that need that visual description. I am Dwanita Mosby-Tyler. I am a Black woman. I'm in my mid-60s. I'm also sort of bumping up my hair because I think I'm well preserved. But mid-60s, grew up in the segregated South, and now for my 30th year, I'm in Colorado. I'll jump right in by showing you this picture. It's me and Spike Lee. And it really was around the time that I started the Equity Project. I wanted a way to do this work of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, equality, accessibility in a way that hadn't been done before. And so I was on a stage with Spike Lee just moderating a conversation about these topics. And I said, what do you think we ought to do differently than we're doing today? And he said to me, don't do all the things, do the right things. And that was the impetus for me starting my consulting practice. I don't do all the things, I do the right thing. So I want you to be thinking about that. Hold to that a minute. But right about the time that I thought, I'm going to do the right things, the world started to change. And we became what has been coined the antisocial century, meaning as Americans, we're spending more time alone than ever before. It's changing us, it's changing our personalities, it's changing our politics, and it's even changing our relationship to reality. And so that sort of flew in the face of how I went about doing my work because I've always felt very strongly that to advance the work of equity, inclusion, diversity, whatever your acronym might be, two things were required. One was proximity, two was love and caring. And this anti-social century, the notion of it, really led me to believe that the things that I thought were core functions of doing this work well and differently were being compromised by the state and the socio context of who we were and where we were. I want you to sit with that for a minute because I want you to begin to think about how the notion of an antisocial century has actually gotten in the way or created a barrier for you in doing this work, or even understanding the work of how do we get people to feel a sense of belonging if we're in less and less proximity to one another and our relationships to reality are beginning to change. So give that one some thought. I also thought I'd share something else that I want you to give some thought to. It's one thing to use an acronym or to have the acronym weaponized. It's quite another one to not know where we came from in the first place. In my visual description, I told you I was in my mid 60s. And because of that, I've lived a long life of going through the cycle of talking about the words that have made up the diversity, equity, and inclusion acronym. It's been called a lot of things. And as a matter of fact, when I got started in this work, we didn't even have an acronym yet because we were only talking about one or two words. So, what I want you to understand is though we've lumped everything into an acronym, the words that we're talking about really stand alone in what they hoped to accomplish. And it's important that we know that history about the word so we know what we're doing and what we're actually talking about. So if you go backwards in time, or when I go backwards in time, when I was growing up, we were in the equality movement. It was all of the social movements that were about level setting, bringing one group up to the same level as another. So you had the women's movement, women's rights movement, you had the civil rights movement, you had the gay rights movement, you had labor movements, you had all of those kind of movements that sought to level set. We have a lot of work to do still, but I want you to go back to how those movements got started and why. It's still important that we understand what the rest of the words are born out of or how they're born out of them. In the 70s and 80s, this is when I was starting my career. We went into the diversity movement. This is where we first started talking about differences out loud. They were there, but we were talking about them out loud. And specifically, we were talking about women and people of color, and not really all people of color, because we mostly were talking about in the South, Black people and white people. But the essence of it all was to get people to appreciate, value, and yes, even the word tolerate was being used to describe differences. I want to put a pin right here. It is in the diversity movement that we probably screwed up the rest of the words because we described the word diversity back then, drum roll, as everything that wasn't white. So if you weren't white, you heard diversity as being something that wasn't you, if you were white. If you weren't white, then you heard the word diversity as being a description of you. And so there goes the impetus of this sort of polarized way that we look at all of these words. I shared that with you because the sentiments that we have today in 2025 weren't just born in 2025. They actually were born in the late 70s, 80s, going into the diversity movement when we started to pull apart on these words. Why? Because we misstated the word some point in some ways, and in some ways, people's understanding of the words weren't very good. In the 90s, we got into inclusion. We got all of this diversity, yay, us. Now we were trying to figure out what to do with all of the diversity. So how do we leverage it for good? How do we leverage it for stronger outcomes? And this is still a work in process that people are still trying to figure out in workplaces today, the power of diversity and what leveraging it really means for the bottom line. Then we got to belonging. And this was an interesting one because it got conflated with the word inclusion. They're not the same thing. They actually don't even seek to do the same thing. Inclusion is what you do with your diversity. Belonging is the affirmation or confirmation that that worked. So, an organization, your workplace gets to say, we're inclusive, but the people in the workplace get to say, I feel a sense of belonging and connection. So, that's the confirmation piece. So, an organization can't make up for itself that we do belonging stuff. And then there's equity and racial equity. We got at that a lot more in the 2000s, although I would argue that the system of education and the system of healthcare was in equity work a lot earlier than a lot of other sectors. And equity really is a little bit different than the rest of these things because it's not about your heart or your mind or your feelings or your biases. It's about your systems. And it is about what you're willing to interrogate in your systems that might be causing harm to people in the system. And so we're less practiced in that one. We use the word a lot, but we're less practiced in it. So I'm sharing this cycle with you, one, because I love you, two, because I'm in proximity to you, and three, because I want you to know what you're talking about when you're talking, that everything isn't equity, just like everything isn't belonging. And the more specific you can get about what you're talking about, the better for all of us. But this is an interesting time to be talking about any of this. And a part of what's happening now is we're just getting stuck. We're immobilized in many ways because there's such an anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion sentiment in the country, and it creates a stuckness. And I wanted you to see the three ways that we can be stuck. We can be strategically stuck, meaning we're just unclear now in our organizations about what the priorities or direction is. Some of you have been working on these topics, and then all of a sudden you're kind of not working on these topics. That's strategic stuck. We just are unclear. There's also emotional stuck. This is personal. This is the fear, the fatigue, the burnout that's happening with the on and off again um, phenomenon around this topic. And then there's structural stuck, meaning there are barriers in the systems, or you feel a lack of power to advance the work. So the key for all of us is, if you look to the right, on the right side of the slide, we got to move from stuck to forward movement. In the middle of stuck is navigating uncertainty. And I guess what I would say to you is that is a natural part of moving out of stuck, that you will begin to navigate things that are uncertain on your way to forward movement. But let's tell the truth. We do have this persistent inertia that happens. It's persistent inertia is this prolonged state of inaction. Even though we know we need change and we need movement, we're stuck. So this persistent inertia sometimes shows up as us just operating under these outdated strategies. Even though they don't align with anything that's going on in the world, we just keep doing them. It's the status quo phenomenon. It also shows up as just being immobilized by uncertainty, meaning it is so complex right now, you're afraid you'll make the wrong move, so you don't move. Or it is us going blah, 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 blah. We're repeatedly talking about change without actually acting on it. And then it sometimes forms these structures or these internal cultures that resist adaptation, even when there are new solutions that we could adopt. So all of those things will show up or can show up with persistent inertia. So I have some tips. There are some strategies for movement, even in a complicated time. So reframing. So shifting the narrative around stagnation. One, what I like to suggest is it's okay to say, right now, we kind of don't know what to do. We're stagnant. We want to make the right moves in this work, but we're stagnant because of the persistent inertia. It's okay to say that in a way that reframes it. And then micro movement. I learned a long time ago, everything doesn't have to be a big move. Sometimes you just need small steps that build the momentum. Community accountability is leaning into your peer networks. You have plenty of peers. Even on this call, there are a ton of you that are a part of a peer network. And so holding each other accountable is powerful. And then purpose realignment. Reconnect with your why. I know you've heard that metaphor a million times, but the reality is if you go back to that cycle that I showed you from equality all the way to equity, think about how that connects with your why. It might be all of those words, or it might be one word in particular. There are a lot of people that really align strongly with what belonging is all about. They want to feel connected at a time when we don't have connection. But you do that for yourself, and you don't have to do matchy matchy and match with everybody else's synopsis of this. It is reconnecting with your why. And why? Because all of these things have to do with this thing. What we want to do, no matter whether you're talking about belonging or diversity or inclusion or quality or equity, what we're trying to do in two words is eliminate outsiderness. We don't want anyone in a workplace, in a system, to feel like they're outside of what's going on. So there's your goal. I just cut your strategic plan down by 200 pages. It's eliminating outsiderness is our goal. And you have to know that to do that, to eliminate outsiderness, every now and then, you're going to have to get to the point where you refuse to ignore the elephant in the room. The elephant could be a person, the elephant can be a process, but whatever it is, it shows up as a barrier to what you're doing. And so we have learned how to navigate around the elephant, underneath the elephant, or under the tail of the elephant. I wouldn't suggest that. We've learned how to navigate it. And the key here is don't necessarily navigate it. Call it what it is and work to remove the barrier from your work to advance those words we talked about. And then I'll end with this, and I always do. You have to know what your story is and what all of this means in your story. It's the best way for connection. It's for you to know what all of this has to do with you. And so tell your story. Tell your story and its relationship. And this story is about me, except I'm 5 years old in this picture. Wanted to be a ballerina, told my parents, they rolled their eyes. They took me to a ballet school. We got to the ballet school. The people at the counter said, "We don't accept Negroes here." That went on for 4 other ballet schools. My mother just drove to all another 4. Same thing. "We don't accept Negroes here." The next day, after that 5th visit, I got to my all black inner city Atlanta kindergarten. I grew up in segregation, and in walked that lady you see in the picture. Well, she was stunning because one, we'd never seen a white person in our school before. Two, she was a ballerina. She was dressed in leotards, tights, and a tutu, and she was standing in front of us and she said, "Good morning, class. My name is Miss Ann, and I'm going to be your ballet teacher." That's kind of the end of the story. Here's the moral of the story. This is a picture of what I think equity is all about. And this is what I learned at 5 years old in kindergarten, right from this picture. One, I learned that equity itself can show up in unsuspecting packages. So that's my hint to you. Don't ever think that it can't be you that's advancing it. That's exactly what Miss Ann was doing. Two, I learned that equity in particular takes bravery and courage. Remember the time I said I was living in? She wasn't supposed to be in that neighborhood, yet she was, and she was bucking the system. I couldn't go to the ballet school, but she could bring it to us. That's equity. And lastly, I learned that equity work takes love and caring and proximity. And that's exactly what happened in this story. These are the components of equity. So the more you can tell your story and what all of this means in your story, it makes more sense and creates the connection that we need to get out of being in an antisocial century. So I'll stop at that. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dwinita. The cycle from the history of where we've been to strategies for the current inertia is just so important for us to realize. I want to encourage our audience to put any questions for Dr. Dwanita in the Q&A section. We've already got a few questions popping up there. We're going to move over to our next speaker, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A today as well. And this is a really great opportunity to speak with a few leaders in this field here. So I'd like to, with that, introduce our next speaker, Cameron Middlebrooks. Cam is a civil rights leader with over 15 years of experience in community organizing, political strategy, and nonprofit leadership. He's currently serves as Deputy Executive Director at Onyx Impact, a national nonprofit building a safer digital world for Black children and families. At Onyx, Cam leads strategy, operations, and cross-sector partnerships, driving efforts like the Digital Green Book and Aisha, an AI-powered advocacy tool for Black communities. Cam's work centers on dismantling structural barriers to employment and opportunity. As Iowa State organizer for the Reform Alliance, Cam focused on expanding workforce access for justice impacted individuals, aligning criminal justice reform with economic mobility. And Cam is committed to justice, digital safety, and empowering Black communities to thrive both online and off. We're really honored to have you with us again here today, Cam. Thanks. And I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, David. Thank you so much. Really, really great to be here. I really hate listening to my bio, but at the end of the day, the way that I think about life, I'm rooted in one core belief. When we remove barriers for those most excluded, we create better systems for everybody. Now, many organizations speak about the language about diversity, equity, inclusion, and we're talking about that today, and that's a good thing. But language is not enough. To move beyond symbolic gestures, we need to understand and dismantle the structures that create inequity in the first place. So let's take a look at some of the facts. In the state of Iowa, where I'm from, and I think I've seen somebody from Davenport in the chat, shout out to Iowa. With my work with reform, we were focused on, as David mentioned, trying to transform the probation and parole system. In Iowa, there's over 60,000 jobs openings today, yet 75% of formerly incarcerated individuals remain unemployed a full year after their release. And Black Iowans specifically are 3 times more likely to be under probation supervision, a system that quietly but powerfully limits access to housing, education, and employment. Now, these aren't just personal failures, they're policy failures and cultural blind spots. They stem from systems that were built without equity in mind. And unless we redesign those systems with good intentions, we won't get very far. Now, while I was at Reform for about 2.5 years to 3, I worked with a coalition of advocates and lawmakers to introduce an earned credits probation bill for folks that are on probation. The idea was simple yet powerful. Reward people for making positive choices, not just punish them for the mistakes. Under this approach, an individual on probation would have the ability to earn time off of their supervision terms in 3 simple ways. The first being what we call a discharge credit. So for every month that the individual was in compliance with their probation terms, whatever they may be, that individual will be able to earn 14 days off of the back end of their supervision term. The second, and that credit right there was mainly focused on incentivizing good behavior while on supervision. But the other 2 credits were the most impactful. One would be a workforce credit. So for every 6 months of employment, an individual will be able to earn 30 days off of their term. And then we had an education credit. So for each academic achievement, whether it was a 2-year degree, 4-year degree, or even going through some type of vocational training, for each achievement, an individual would earn a 90-day reduction to their term. Now, this policy was data driven and cost effective and grounded in restorative justice principles. Though we didn't pass it in Iowa quite yet, we have passed, as a Reform Alliance, passed similar pieces of legislation in about 12 states across the country, thanks to bipartisan coalitions. Yes, I did say bipartisan, even in the past several years. It is possible. We've worked alongside conservative groups like the Americans for Prosperity and Faith and Freedom Coalition and progressive allies such as the NAACP and the ACLU. Why? Because at Reform, we believe in a simple principle: no permanent enemies, no permanent allies, only permanent issues. And our permanent issue is this: helping people exit supervision and reenter society with dignity and opportunity. And that opportunity really focuses on getting folks back into the workforce. But public policy is just one side of that coin. At Onyx Impact, we know that at Onyx Impact, we know that internal workplace culture is just as critical. I want you to ask yourself 3 simple questions. Are we evaluating performance in ways that reflect cultural or class bias? Are we hiring for fit or for diverse perspectives, resilience, and vision? And do all employees feel psychologically safe? Or are some still forced to code switch just to survive every single day at work? An anti-racist workplace is not one where everyone thinks alike. It's one where power is shared, not hoarded. Harm is acknowledged, not avoided. And diversity is cultivated, not just performative. That looks like transparent pay bands, promotion criteria, and advancement paths. Equitable professional development based not on who you know, but on what you bring to the table. And trauma-informed leadership that knows how to listen, repair, and grow. It also means doing the invisible work of calling out how race, history, and economics shape access to opportunities in every institution. So here's a challenge many leaders overlook. Digital environments, even outside of the office, are shaping equity inside the workplace. Some examples that may happen is online harassment and doxing targeting minority professionals, algorithmic amplification of anti-Black content, anti-minority content, conspiracies, and stereotypes. And parents are struggling to shield their kids from the platforms that reinforce racialized trauma, beauty standards, and cultural erasure. If you're serious about building inclusive workplaces, you need to consider digital safety, information literacy, and algorithmic accountability as part of your equity strategy. That's why at Onyx, we built Aisha. It's an AI-powered assistant rooted in Black culture, ethics, and lived experience. Aisha will help folks navigate the workplace, start and grow businesses, protect your kids online, and challenge digital disinformation. Now, our AI tool lives on our platform called the Digital Green Book, which is a modern day homage to the Green Book that once guided Black travelers safely through the Jim Crow area. And you can visit that website at digitalgreenbook.org to explore more. And you'll be able to find opportunities for parental control guides for YouTube, TikTok, and all those other crazy social media sites. You can utilize the AI tool to identify conversation starters on race and safety at home and at work. And most definitely digital safety checklists for employers, educators, and parents. Now, these tools are for families, HR teams, community leaders, and tech builders alike, because safety and empowerment in the digital age should never be an afterthought. So in closing, where do we go from here? Whether you work in tech, HR, education, public policy, or social impact, the work of equity belongs to all of us. And the questions we need to ask are we designing systems that work for the most vulnerable or just ones that look good on paper? Are we satisfied with diversity in the room, or are we building shared power, protection, and purpose in the workplace? Let's be clear. Equity isn't about being perfect. It's about having the courage to change the rules so that everyone has a real shot. So I will leave y'all with this. Let's build a workplace where truth is protected, dignity is the norm, and leadership looks like all of us. David, I appreciate the time for everybody, and we'll turn back over to you for, I think, Q&A session is about to start.
Thanks, Cam. Such an important aspect of this conversation with the growing usage of AI and, and just conversations with you and learning a little bit more about Aisha. And I know some of our participants today want to find out more about how they can access the Digital Green Book and Aisha. So I don't know if you want to put that in chat, or we can certainly send it as part of the follow-up email as well. I'll ask Duanita to join us as well again today. I see a couple questions in Q&A, and we have some time for Q&A today. And so I'm going to start with something that Cam mentioned, which is safety. We work on total worker health a lot, workplace health and safety, with organizations, with individuals. And Duanita, I'm curious with what you talked about, with where we've been, with the current state. This conversation came up about how do I approach equity at my organization, and also think about my own psychological and physical safety. I know that's a big question, but given your background and your experience, and Cam, I'll ask you this question as well. We always want to make sure we're protecting worker safety. This conversation can be difficult for people, and so how do you help people center around feeling psychologically safe despite the fact that there may be some discomfort in this conversation. And then I'm assuming we always want to work to keep people physically safe, regardless of our background. But any thoughts there on how psychological and physical safety relates to this conversation?
Yeah, thanks, David. I have some thoughts, and one would be it would be to me impossible to advance any of the words that I had in that cycle if you didn't have psychological safety in the middle of that model. It's the precursor to you doing anything. And so here's our hiccup. Our hiccup is we jump right into those words without addressing psychological safety.
Mm.
And so people get squarely in the middle of the work, like the work of racial equity was a great example of it. People get squarely in the middle of it and then they don't feel safe anymore. It's because you didn't start with psychological safety and the preparedness that goes along with that. One of the best models, and you all probably know it, is when the Surgeon General did the mental health in the workplace model in 2022. It talks about psychological safety as a part of its model. And so I'll put it in chat. I absolutely believe you can't do one without the other. Maybe I can't put it in chat, but you can put it in chat.
We can do that. We can do that.
Okay.
Cam, you mentioned psychological safety in your conversation, and I know you've done a lot of work with, people coming out of the criminal justice system, and safety is such an important topic right now. And I think um, a lot of the conversation we're having about some of these words and bringing up some of these topics, uh, I think uncomfort and discomfort has turned into, do I really feel safe having these conversations or not? And so I'm just curious your thoughts about how it intersects. I know you already brought it up, but what else do you want us to know about,
Yeah,
psychological and
thank you,
physical
David.
safety? Yeah.
I mean, that's as the doctor said, that's where everything starts, right? If someone does not feel safe physically or mentally in the workplace or in our communities, right? I don't think you can move past that without that safety first. When I'm working with individuals that are returning to society, right, that is one of their biggest barriers. Many of them have been institutionalized, right? And when they come back into the workforce, there's a what I call like a scarlet letter, right? Everybody thinks that they're a felon. Everybody thinks that they're a criminal, right? And that barrier stops them from succeeding a lot of times, and folks give up on themselves, right? I really think, and I think about this in many spaces in life, we have to be able to meet people where they're at, right, in order to pull them along and bring them along. As a leader of an organization, and when I say a leader, right, I'm not talking about you don't have to just be the boss, right? But there's leaders at every level within an organization, finding and identifying someone who's willing to pull folks in instead of calling folks out.
Well, you brought up the word leader, Cam, so I'm going to stick with you for the next question, which has come up in the chat. And questions about how to get leaders to engage in topics probably comes up at every webinar that we have, whether it's on heat exposures in the workplace, which is our last one was, or family-friendly workplace environments, whether it be these conversations on inclusion and belonging that we've now had for 5 or 6 years in a row, or mental health in the workplace like we had in May. How do we get leaders to move? Especially maybe in environments where people feel like leaders maybe aren't willing to have these conversations. And I know maybe the solution is small steps. I know that that's what Juanita you were talking about, but what are the things should we either as individual leaders or as people who are advocating to leaders, what should we think about in terms of getting leaders to act on some of these things?
Well, that's a great question. The militant side of myself says you have to demand it. But that's not always the safest thing to do when you're the employee. But I always go back to dialogue, right? You don't have to wait on the leader to have those dialogues amongst yourself and amongst your coworkers. And I think at the end of the day, leaders are gonna how do I want to say this? I still go back to demand. You got to demand it. We're in a society right now where you can't be quiet. We can no longer be quiet about the issues that matter. We can no longer be quiet about safety in the workplace, advancement in the workplace.
Mm.
You're just as much as part of that team as the leader is, and find the routes to have those conversations, uh, whether it's structured through the employment or having those small conversations, right? Getting to know your neighbor, getting to know your coworker, understanding where they're from. I mean, we all bring diversity of perspectives, whether you're black, white, this, that, or the third. Our backgrounds are innately diverse, right? And having those conversations at the water cooler, over lunch, meeting folks, and really getting to know the person next to you, uh, besides what leadership is doing. I don't know if I necessarily answered your question, David, other than demand, demand, demand.
Well, I appreciate that perspective. That's easier said for some than others. And I know, do I need to? I'll move over to you with this question about how to engage leadership. You've been in the C-suite. I know you have. I've worked with you in C-suite positions, and I know you're a consultant to leaders, both personally and for organizations as well now. And so, again, this comes up around how do I talk about mental health in the workplace? How do I talk about psychological safety in the workplace? How do I talk about my current feelings in the current DEI environment? Any suggestions you have as both someone who's been in the C-suite and now consults with C-suite professionals?
Yeah, David. One thing I think we have to be clear about is not all leaders were trained to even know what to do with all of that stuff you just said.
Right.
It isn't a part of the core competencies in some cases.
Mm,
Surprise, surprise, then people don't feel ill equipped to do it. So one of the things that I really believe in is we're going to have to get out of being status quo about leadership and begin to tie leadership performance to the things that we want to see. For
mm,
example, equity in a workplace doesn't necessarily just happen because you're the leader. You have to tie people to what systems did you interrogate? What did you deconstruct or get rid of? And how has that then advanced some of the outcomes that you want to see? Just like we would do with any other strategic factors, we need to do this with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we need to get past only looking at diversity. It's important. But when you think about the major systems change that Cameron is talking about, you got to get to equity and you've got to be able to measure that you've actually done something with the system that didn't exist before you got involved.
mm. So true. I think that point about as leaders, whether you're in middle management, a supervisor, or the leader of an organization, you don't necessarily get any training on this conversation either. And so perhaps focusing on curiosity and listening and getting to know one another, which I know both of you have talked about, getting to know people and their backgrounds is a really smart first step, is just how do we relate to one another as people? Taking the leadership supervisor hat off for a moment, getting to know people's backgrounds, getting to know one another a little bit better, because none of us, and some leaders have gotten training on this, some others have not. And so I think it's a really important point to remember is even though these individuals are leading organizations, some of them have taken upon themselves to get some of this training. Sometimes the organization has provided additional training, but it's not a core competency for being a supervisor, manager, or leader in most organizations. Cam, there's a couple questions for you here in the Q&A. Are you advocating, or what are your thoughts about creating a completely new system around whether that be AI, with from a racial equity lens, or revamping systems that already exist but may not have been designed by or for people of color? So I'm assuming you've thought about this before. When I think about rebuilding something from the ground up versus sort of revamping or refreshing something, both have their advantages and disadvantages. I'm curious if you've given any thought to where we're at, whether it be organizationally or with AI, and your approach there on rebuilding versus remodeling, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, I think with Aisha, I wouldn't say it's a complete rebuild. The baseline of Aisha is ChatGPT. We're working with a tech company that their main focus is creating chatbots across the board for organizations like banks, so on and so forth, right? But in addition to that, we trained our chatbot on Black culture. We have a partnership with the Black Journalists Association, where we're linking Black media and Black news in the system. So when you ask Aisha a question, instead of it searching the internet right away, the first checkpoint that it's going to go to is our partnership with NMPA, which is the Black Journalists Association. Even if you go to Aisha right now and you type in your state, it's going to give you links to Black publications within your state, how to subscribe to it, how to follow them on social media. I wouldn't say it's a complete revamp, but it was important to us to have something that was culturally sensitive. One thing that I would be afraid to do is ask the internet what it means to be Black. right? That's Chat GPT, what it means to be black. I would be horrified. One example that we give a lot of times, and some folks may know this saying in black culture, but when we say God is good, folks say all the time, right? If you ask ChatGPT that, I'm not sure what the answer is going to be, but when you ask Aisha, it's going to say all the time. We were intentional in ensuring that it had the essence of black culture, but this doesn't need to stop at just black culture, right? I would love to see a world where each demographic or organization or people group develops their own culturally sensitive AI. We know AI is here, it is the future. And if we're not working and figuring it out right now, we're going to be left behind. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's not a complete revamp, but it
Mm-hmm.
is enhancing the system so it's culturally sensitive to the communities that I serve. But would love to see it serve other communities as well.
I really appreciate that answer. I mean, my background is in sociology and anthropology, my undergraduate degree. I feel like we're always evolving, and this idea that we're going to totally start brand new and fresh is probably unrealistic. We're always sort of building on something, and I think, Juanita, that's what I really loved about your cycles graph is like some of these words have been around a long time before I was even born, and people like yourselves and others have been doing this work for a really long time. It's evolved and it's continuing to evolve. But it's probably not, we just start all over. We're not in a position where we do that. We just continuously evolve and refresh and that can be hard too. I understand that. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Dr. Mosby Tyler, on that question about you're good? I do want to ask a question that's come up for individuals that are working in the DEI space, because there's a number of us on the webinar today about either what potential obstacles or barriers you've faced. I'll start with you, Dr. Mosby Tyler, if you don't mind telling us a little bit more about if you've had any potential pushback or blowback. And again, you don't need to individually identify companies or people, but how do you keep yourself going in this environment? What are some tips maybe you have for other individuals that maybe need to double down on self-care or things to be aware of as we continue this conversation around inclusion?
I think the important thing is to not forget to be curious. As much as some of this is disheartening, there is an element in it that should make you curious. So when you introduced me, David, and you said I was working on a second doctorate, I'm sure people were scratching their head like, why on earth would you do that? Well, I'm doing it because I've got a curiosity about a population. So I'm working on a second doctorate because I'm studying engagement factors with rural conservative communities across the country. And so I'm actually going into these rural communities, and instead of just believing the hype from the rhetoric that we hear on the news, I actually want to talk to people in those communities to see what either engages them or disengages them from the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to hear it from their mouths. I
Mm,
don't want to include biases. That's where my curiosity is. So the first thing I would say is just even in all of this angst, don't forget to be curious, because some of the answers to some of the questions are in our curiosity. But if you're in a perpetual inertia, you lose your sense of curiosity too. So I just think it's really important. I'm learning a lot about what communities, those communities in particular, rural conservative communities, really believe that DE&I is. They don't have a good sense of the fact that they are in the acronym too.
mm.
So what an opportunity for us to straighten that out.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Such an important word, and being curious is something I try and foster as a health equity trainer on the University of Colorado Anschutz medical campus. Curiosity is often the thing I want people to take away from the conversation. It can be hard to do when we feel stuck, when we get charged, and remembering to have a curious mindset, like we did maybe when we were children, is such an important component of advancing this work too. Cam, how about you? What strategies do you have for keeping going? You talked about your work with the NAACP and demanding things. There's and you said you don't always go to the militant side of things, but there's a fight obviously going on too. And so how do you balance that with need for self-care, need for being curious and meeting other people where they're at?
Yeah, I mean, I really love what the doctor said. It actually reminded me of a time about a couple years ago when I was working for Iowa State Extension and Outreach, and we were doing leadership academies across the state of Iowa, which outside of Des Moines, Iowa's basically all conservative rural, right? But at the same time, I just did a program in the city of Des Moines called Bridging the Gap, where we went out to the community with the end goal of trying to find equitable policy solutions, right? And after a series of circles and conversations, the focus that the Des Moines community had was housing and employment. A few weeks after that program wrapped up with Iowa State, I was in Atlantic, Iowa, which is a rural community, having a leadership discussion and asking them about their barriers. And I thought going in, their barriers would be completely different from inner city Des Moines. However, they were the same. They were focused on housing, they were focused on employment opportunities and access to Wi-Fi, right? So to the doctor's point, when you really get out into these communities and you ask the questions and you're being curious, you identify that some of the issues that we face are very similar, right? And understanding that, it changed my mind and my thought process on a lot of stuff. But the fight is, man, progress is a slow process. Let's go back to this quote. Progress is a slow process, but if you quit, it doesn't speed it up, right? But with that, to your point, Dave, you said this a couple times. Self-care is important, right? You see a lot of people, especially advocates, they get burnt out over time. And for myself, I've just identified different ways for the fight. You know, I used to be in the streets marching all the time, working for the NAACP, volunteering and pushing information out like that. But I decided, hey, that's sometimes I got to give up that mantle and give that leadership role to somebody else and go fight it from a different angle where I have a little bit more time for myself and get ready for the big fights that are ahead. We got midterms here in less than 2 years, right? When I think about civic engagement, the vote matters, but how do we hold people accountable every single day while they're in office or while they're an elected official or appointed official? And that takes, it's not just one person. You got to spread the wealth with that and engaging members of your community to help fight with you. So you're not just the only one out there doing the work.
Yeah, I appreciate how that relates back to social connection, like Dr. Duanita was talking about at the beginning too, right? We've isolated ourselves so much, and the more we can rely on the systems of support that are meaningful to us, I think the more we'll feel connected in advancing this work. There's two questions left in Q&A. I'm going to approach the first one for Cam, one because it's for Cam, and then the second one I'm going to approach to you, Dr. Mosby Tyler, and then we'll wrap up. So, related to people coming out of probation or in probation or coming out of carceral settings. How do you help create, on the employer side, what sort of work needs to be done to help individuals feel like they're included and feel like they belong at workplaces? Any strategies you've deployed there that specifically on the organizational side for someone coming back into the workplace?
Sure. Well, I mean, all of our work we do in coalition. When I spoke of that coalition with conservative groups and progressive groups, the main chunk of our coalition were organizations that are in workforce development, reentry type work. One organization here in Des Moines is called Change Course. What they do, it's about a six month intensive programming where folks meet once a week with that organization. But the leaders of that organization goes out and builds relationships with employers, right? So it's a soft handoff once that person is ready to upskill themselves into employment. In addition to that, we have to give people a round of applause when they do good, right? Another organization, our coalition, was a group called Job Honors Awards, where every single year they honored organizations that were doing a good job at second chance hiring and hiring people with disabilities, right? Giving people their flowers. It's amazing how many people want to be patted on the back, right? And when folks do good, we have to promote that, right? So really, it's about creating those relationships between reentry organizations and workforce development groups that are working with that population. So it is a soft handoff, and they understand the type of workers that they need and type of skill sets that they need, so they can go do the work to upskill those individuals once they return to the community. And then when you have employers that are doing a good job at second chance hiring and promotion, you have to applaud them and promote that in the community as well, because others will want to get involved with that.
Yeah, I totally agree with the storytelling aspect of this as well, right? As soon as there's stories and recognition to be given in this space, we need to do a really good job highlighting that because you're right. oftentimes organizations don't want to be the first one, but as soon as they hear of colleagues, they also don't want to be the last one doing this work as well, right? And so that's been the case, whether it's supporting family-friendly environments and paid family leave in my career, or supporting people in recovery from substance use disorder, or coming out of carceral settings. People want to be involved in this work, and I do think we need to, give companies the flowers that they deserve for engaging in it. Dr. Duanita, we're going to close with with the last question here, which is, whether it be the higher education system or government system, there's some large systems out there that are really grappling with this conversation around inclusion and belonging. And any steps? I know you said take small steps. So let's say I'm a frontline or essential employee. I'm not necessarily a manager or supervisor, and I work in one of these large systems. I'm taking care of my self-care, but I'm not necessarily thrilled with how things are going at my institution or wherever it is, my large system that I work within. This is the case for big companies as well. What should I think about as an individual employee in this situation?
So I would draw people back to the cycle that I shared to figure out where you want to do the work, because you're probably not going to do all of them. And so I would say in a time like now, we need to be looking at what it's going to take for us to have a sense of belonging in the system that we're in. So as we're making these micro movements and the small incremental changes, what is it going to take for me to feel like I'm connected and a part of? And don't be afraid to share that with supervisors or other leaders, that these are the kinds of things that you need. Remember, we're flying in the face of being antisocial and not in proximity. And so we're going to have to reclaim those elements that made us be an antisocial environment. And to reclaim those means you're going to have to be able to articulate what you need to feel that sense of connection. So the more we can do that, the better. That's why you've got so many people working on belonging right now.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, I just really appreciate you, Dr. Duanita and Cameron, for joining us for today's conversation. I'm really grateful for the hundreds of people that showed up on today's webinar and some of the great questions that you asked and comments. It's great to see people from all over the country engaging in this conversation. As I mentioned, we've been privileged to have this conversation around belonging and inclusion in the workplace for 6 consecutive years in June. Don't forget that tomorrow is the Juneteenth holiday, and people are taking the day off. They're focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in their own personal and professional lives as well. And so our next webinar, we're going to take a little bit of a break for the summer that you'll be invited to when you complete the survey that is being shared in chat and is going to pop up when you leave today's webinar, is on the recovery-friendly workplace. And we've had 5 consecutive years of conversations about supporting people in recovery from substance use disorders and their work experience as well. We have a specific focus on the September recovery-friendly workplace conversation this year on the medical profession, on healthcare. We'll be joined by an MD, a dentist, a DDS, and a nurse, an RN, and talk about what it means to be in recovery in the medical profession, in the healthcare space. And so we hope you're able to join us for that conversation. September is Recovery Month, and so there'll be a lot of things going on related to recovery and where you are and at work and at home as well. And so thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. We leave the Zoom open for just a moment so that you can access the survey. It is also available in the chat. Just grateful that we get to have these conversations. Again, thank you, Dr. Mosby Tyler. Thank you, Cameron, for participating in today's dialogue and discussion. We appreciate your perspectives. We appreciate the work you do, and thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great afternoon.